In 1952, the Republican Party selected the great general of World War II, Dwight D. Eisenhower, as its candidate for president.
You have summoned me on behalf of millions of your fellow Americans to lead a great crusade for freedom in America and freedom in the world.
Running on a promise to end the war in Korea, Eisenhower became the first Republican president in 20 years. In 1953, Eisenhower fulfilled his promise and brought the fighting in Korea to an end. Times were good in the 1950s, but not for everyone. Ever since the Supreme Court's decision of Plessy v. Ferguson, segregation had been legal in schools, restaurants, hotels, and public places throughout the nation. Separate but equal was the law. But then, in the 1950s, came a major challenge to that Supreme Court ruling, and it all began with a 7-year-old girl. Linda Carol Brown lived in Topeka, Kansas. She had to walk across railroad tracks and take an old bus to get to school, even though there was a better school 5 blocks from her house. Linda couldn't go to that school because she was black, and the schools in Topeka were segregated. In 1951, Linda's father, the Reverend Oliver Brown, went to court to try to do something about it. Their case became known as Brown v. Board of Education, and it went all the way to the Supreme Court. Thurgood Marshall, the great-grandson of a slave, was the lawyer who read the opening statement in the case. It was December 9th, 1952.
Ever since the Emancipation Proclamation, the Negro has been trying to get the same status as anybody else, regardless of race.
Did segregation break the rules of the Constitution? Marshall and the lawyers for the National Association for the Advancement of Colored People said it did. They said the 14th Amendment, which guaranteed all citizens equal privileges under the law, made the doctrine of separate but equal unconstitutional. Marshall said that segregated schools could never be truly equal because separating people based on race made them feel unequal and inferior.
Like a cancer, segregation destroys the morale of our citizens and disfigures our country throughout the world.
A year passed. It looked as if the court might be split. That would mean no decision in the case, and segregation could legally continue in America. Then, President Eisenhower named a new Chief Justice to the Supreme Court. He was Earl Warren, the former governor of California. 7 months after he assumed the bench, the waiting in the historic case was finally over. On May 17, 1954, Chief Justice Warren read the court's decision in Brown v. Board of Education.
Does segregation of children in public schools solely on the basis of race deprive children of the minority group of equal educational opportunities? We believe it does. We conclude unanimously that the doctrine of separate but equal has no place. Separate educational facilities are inherently unequal.
Brown versus Board of Education was a milestone in the history of American law. This overturned a decision from more than 50 years previously, Plessy versus Ferguson, which allowed racial segregation. It didn't desegregate the schools very rapidly at all. Legal decisions don't do that. It requires people acting to overturn injustice. But it put the government on record as no longer willing to support the racial segregation of the South.
Brown v. Board of Education might have been a new birth of freedom, as the Washington Post called it, but Americans now face the difficult task of living up to those lofty words. I'm Katie Couric. Join me again for Freedom, a History of Us.